The frequency. The first sign that humanity was not alone came not as a flash of light across the sky or a thunderous roar from the heavens, but as a sound, a low, pulsing hum that only children could hear. On the morning of September 14th, across every continent, every city, every forgotten village on Earth, children under the age of 12 stopped what they were doing, turned their faces toward the clouds, and began to scream. Dr. Alina Vasquez was in the middle of a routine neurology consultation at St. Michael's Hospital in Chicago when her patient, an 8-year-old boy named Marcus, suddenly went rigid in his chair. His eyes rolled back, showing only white, and from his throat came a sound that Alina would never forget, a high-pitched wail that seemed to vibrate at a frequency that made her teeth ache and her vision blur. She grabbed Marcus by the shoulders, shouting his name, but he didn't respond. Blood began trickling from his nose and then from his ears, and when Alina looked through the window into the pediatric ward beyond, she saw every child doing the same thing. The screaming lasted exactly 47 seconds. Then silence. Then the sky above Chicago split open like a wound, and something descended through the clouds that made Alina Vasquez, a woman of science, of logic, of carefully measured truths, fall to her knees and pray to a God she hadn't believed in since childhood. The ship was not silver or chrome or any color that human language could adequately describe. It shifted and rippled like oil on water, its surface alive with patterns that hurt to look at, geometric shapes that seemed to fold in on themselves and expand outward simultaneously. It was massive, larger than any structure humanity had ever built, casting a shadow over the entire downtown area that plunged millions into premature darkness. And it was not alone. Within minutes, reports flooded in from every major city on Earth: Tokyo, London, Mumbai, Sao Paulo, Moscow, Cairo. 12 ships, each one identical, each one hanging silently above a population center like a judgment waiting to be delivered. For 3 days the ships did nothing. They simply hovered, silent and immense, while humanity collectively held its breath. The children who had screamed were now catatonic, unresponsive to any treatment, their brain scans showing activity patterns that no neurologist could interpret. Governments convened in emergency sessions. Military forces mobilized. Religious leaders declared the end times. And ordinary people did what ordinary people always do in the face of the incomprehensible. They went to work, kissed their loved ones, and told themselves that somehow everything would be fine. Lina Vasquez did not go to work. She stayed at Marcus's bedside, monitoring his vitals, running test after test, searching for any explanation that might make sense in a world where sense had suddenly become a luxury. On the third night, as she dozed in the uncomfortable hospital chair, Marcus opened his eyes, looked directly at her, and spoke in a voice that was not his own, a layered, harmonic voice that seemed to come from multiple throats at once. "They are listening for the frequency," he said. "They need to find the carriers before the others do." Then his eyes closed, and he was gone again, leaving Alina with a chill in her bones and a terrible certainty that she had just been given a warning she didn't yet understand. The invasion began at dawn on the 4th day. There were no ultimatums, no demands for surrender, no attempts at communication that humanity could recognize. The ships simply opened, and from their undersides poured a cascade of smaller vessels, sleek, angular craft that moved with impossible speed and precision. They descended on the cities not with weapons blazing, but with something far more insidious. A fine silver mist sprayed from their hulls, settling over neighborhoods and business districts and suburbs like morning dew. Those who breathed it in felt nothing at first. Some reported a slight metallic taste, a momentary dizziness, and then normalcy. They went about their days feeling perfectly fine, while inside their bodies, something was changing at the cellular level. General David Chen stood in the Pentagon's underground command center, watching the feeds from surveillance drones around the world, feeling a helplessness that threatened to drown him. He was 62 years old, a veteran of 3 wars, a man who had built his entire identity around the belief that any problem could be solved with enough firepower and strategic thinking. But what do you do when the enemy doesn't fight? What do you do when they simply spread? The mist had now covered 40% of the global population, and medical reports were beginning to trickle in that made his blood run cold. The affected weren't dying. They weren't even getting sick. They were changing. MRI scans showed new neural pathways forming in their brains, synaptic connections that shouldn't exist, structures that resembled nothing in any medical textbook. And they were all connected. Every single affected individual showed synchronized brainwave patterns, as if they were all part of the same vast, thinking network. "They're building something," said Dr. Yuki Tanaka, the lead xenobiologist on Chen's hastily assembled advisory team. She was young, barely 30, with dark circles under her eyes and a tremor in her hands that spoke to the 3 sleepless nights she'd endured. A hive mind, a collective consciousness. They're not conquering us with weapons. They're assimilating us. Every person exposed to that mist is becoming part of them. Chen felt the weight of command crushing him. How long until the entire population is exposed? Tanaka's face was pale. At current rates of dispersal, 6 weeks, maybe less if they accelerate. 6 weeks. 6 weeks until humanity ceased to exist as a collection of individuals and became something else entirely, something that belonged to the beings in the ships. Chen had spent his life preparing for wars against human enemies, enemies he could understand, predict, and ultimately defeat. But this was not a war. This was an extinction, quiet, methodical, and almost gentle in its efficiency. But humanity is not a species that goes quietly. Within days of the invasion's true nature becoming apparent, resistance cells began forming around the world. Unaffected individuals, those who had been indoors when the mist fell, those in isolated areas, those who had simply been lucky, banded together in underground networks. They communicated through encrypted channels, shared information about the aliens' patterns and weaknesses, and most importantly, they searched for the one thing that might give humanity a fighting chance: the children. Elena Vasquez became part of the resistance almost by accident. 3 days after the mist began falling, she was approached in the hospital parking garage by a man who looked like he hadn't slept in weeks. His name was James Akoy, a former CDC epidemiologist who had been studying the effects of the mist on the affected population. He told her that the children, the ones who had screamed on the first day, were different. They hadn't been exposed to the mist like the adults. They had been activated. Something in their DNA had been triggered by a signal from the ships, and now they carried within them a genetic marker that the aliens were desperately searching for. "They call them carriers," Akoy explained, his voice barely above a whisper. "And whatever they carry, the aliens need it enough to invade an entire planet to find it." Elena thought of Marcus, unconscious in his hospital bed, speaking with a voice that wasn't his own. "They need to find the carriers before the others do." "Others?" she asked. "What others?" Akoy's expression darkened. "That's what we need to find out." The resistance established its primary base in an abandoned coal mine in West Virginia, deep enough underground to shield them from the alien scanning technology. Over the following weeks, they gathered resources, recruited survivors, and most importantly, collected the catatonic children from hospitals and homes across the eastern seaboard. They had 47 children now, all unresponsive, all showing the same anomalous brain activity. And they had Alina, the only neurologist willing to descend into the depths of their fractured minds to find answers. The breakthrough came on a cold November night, when Alina finally succeeded in establishing a neural link with one of the children, a 12-year-old girl named Sophie, who had been a piano prodigy before the invasion and was now nothing more than a breathing shell. Using a combination of advanced EEG equipment and experimental neurostimulators that Akoi had salvaged from a university lab, Alina managed to interface directly with Sophie's altered brain patterns. What she found there was not what anyone had expected. Sophie's consciousness was not dormant, it was screaming. Through the neural link, Alina experienced fragments of Sophie's awareness, a consciousness trapped in a body it could no longer control, surrounded by voices that were not human. She saw through Sophie's mind's eye glimpses of the beings in the ships. They were not what humanity had imagined, not little gray men or tentacled monsters. They were geometry given form, shifting patterns of light and dark that existed in more dimensions than human perception could process. And they were afraid, terrified in fact. Because the frequency that had activated the children, that had revealed the carriers hidden among humanity, had not been transmitted by them. It had come from somewhere else. Something else, something that was coming. Alina broke the connection gasping, tears streaming down her face, her mind reeling from revelations she could barely process. The resistance leaders gathered around her, demanding answers, but all she could do was repeat what Sophie had shown her, again and again, until the words stopped sounding like words and started sounding like a prayer. "They're not invaders," she whispered. "They're refugees. They're running from something, and they came here because we have something they need to survive. Something hidden in our DNA, something that can protect them from what's hunting them." General Chen, who had defected to the resistance after the president was exposed to the mist and became part of the collective, slammed his fist against the table. "So what? They're still destroying us. They're still taking our people. Whatever they're running from, they're using us as shields." "Not shields," Alina corrected, her voice hollow. "Weapons, the carriers, the children. They're the key to something, some kind of defense. The aliens can't use it themselves. They need human minds to channel it. That's why they're assimilating us. They're trying to find the carriers, trying to activate whatever's dormant in our species." "And if they find them," Akoi asked, "if they activate this weapon?" Alina closed her eyes, remembering the terror she had felt in Sophie's mind, a terror that was not for humanity but for everything. "Then maybe they survive. Maybe we all do, but if the thing that's hunting them finds us first." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. The war that followed was unlike any conflict in human history. It was fought on two fronts, against the alien collective that was systematically assimilating Earth's population, and against time itself, as the resistance raced to understand the children's power before it was too late. Small victories came at enormous cost. The resistance discovered that high-frequency sound waves could temporarily disrupt the neural network connecting the assimilated, giving them windows of opportunity to rescue loved ones, gather resources, and strike at the aliens' ground operations. But for every victory, there were a dozen defeats. Entire resistance cells were wiped out when their locations were discovered. Trusted allies were revealed to be assimilated spies, their minds no longer their own. And every day, the sky grew darker, as if the sun itself was being slowly eclipsed by something beyond human perception. Alina worked tirelessly with the children, diving deeper into their shared consciousness, piecing together fragments of alien memory and purpose. She learned that the beings called themselves the Resonance, and that they had once been the dominant species in a galaxy far older than humanity's. They had built civilizations that spanned star systems, created technologies that bent the fabric of reality, and believed themselves invincible until they encountered the silence. The silence was not a species or a force in any conventional sense. It was an absence, a void, a hunger that consumed consciousness itself. Wherever it spread, thinking beings simply stopped. Their bodies continued to function, their hearts continued to beat, but their minds were gone, devoured by something that existed between the frequencies of reality. The resonance had been fleeing the silence for millennia, jumping from world to world, always one step ahead, always searching for a weapon that could fight something that couldn't be touched or seen or reasoned with. And they had found one, on Earth, in humanity. There was something unique about human consciousness, a frequency, a resonance, that the silence couldn't touch. Something in the way human minds processed reality, something in the chaotic, illogical, brilliantly messy way that humans thought and felt and dreamed. The carriers were those in whom this frequency was strongest, a genetic legacy passed down from ancestors who had survived encounters with the silence in prehistory, when the cosmic hunters had briefly touched Earth before being driven away by something they couldn't understand. The children weren't just immune to the silence. They were anathema to it. And if their power could be harnessed, amplified, transmitted across the collective consciousness of an entire species. They want to use us as a broadcast tower, Alina explained to the Resistance Council, her voice tight with exhaustion and barely contained rage. They assimilate our population, connect everyone to the collective, then channel the carrier's frequency through the network. It would create a shield, a psychic barrier that the silence couldn't penetrate. And the assimilated, Chen asked, what happens to them? Alina couldn't meet his eyes. The process, it would burn them out, every connected. Mind would be used as a conduit for the frequency. They would survive, but, she swallowed hard, they wouldn't be people anymore, just echoes, empty vessels maintaining the shield. The room erupted in outrage, arguments and recriminations flying in all directions. But Alina barely heard them, because she had realized something else during her sessions with the children, something she had been trying desperately to deny. The silence wasn't just coming, it was already here. She had felt its presence at the edges of Sophie's consciousness, a cold, patient emptiness that was watching, waiting, learning. It had followed the resonance to Earth, and it was already beginning to feed. The final battle came on a day when the sky turned the color of bruises and the assimilated suddenly went still, millions of people stopping mid-motion as their shared consciousness detected what Alina had already sensed. The silence was emerging. In cities around the world, people simply stopped walking, stopped talking, stopped breathing. Not dead, but empty, their minds scooped out of their bodies like ice cream from a cone. The resonance ships began to rise, their surfaces rippling with patterns of panic, preparing to flee as they had fled 1,000 times before. But humanity was not ready to become a footnote in someone else's extinction. The resistance had been preparing for this moment. Using the knowledge Alina had gathered, they had built a device, a crude, jury-rigged amplifier powered by nuclear reactor cores stolen from submarines and configured according to specifications that Sophie had transmitted through her catatonic state. It was designed to do what the resonance had planned, but on humanity's terms. Not through forced assimilation, but through voluntary connection. Not burning out minds, but channeling them. Alina stood in the heart of the machine, surrounded by the 47 children who were now awake, their eyes glowing with a light that was not quite human. Around her, resistance fighters manned stations, their faces grim with determination and fear. And beyond the walls of their underground fortress, she could feel the silence pressing in, an infinite hunger that was moments away from breaking through. This might not work, she said to Akoi, who stood at her side, his hand resting on the activation switch. He smiled, the first genuine smile she had seen since the invasion began. "It has." "Two," he said simply, "because the alternative is unthinkable." The machine activated, and for a brief, eternal moment, Alina Vasquez felt every human mind on Earth, the assimilated and the free, the believers and the skeptics, the saints and the sinners. She felt their fear, their love, their desperate hope, their ancient rage against the dying of the light. And she channeled it all through the children, through the frequency that made humanity unique, through the chaos and the brilliance and the stubborn refusal to simply cease. The silence recoiled. For the first time in its existence, it encountered something it couldn't consume, a consciousness too vibrant, too chaotic, too alive to be digested. It shrieked across frequencies that shattered windows and stopped hearts, and then it fled, withdrawing back into the spaces between realities, wounded in a way it had never been wounded before. The resonance ships hung motionless in the sky, their patterns expressing something that might have been amazement. Then, one by one, they began to descend, not to continue the invasion but to land, to meet, to negotiate, because humanity had just done what no species had ever done before, not just survived the silence but heard it, driven it away, made it afraid. In the aftermath, as the sun finally broke through the clouds for the first time in months, Alina sat with Sophie in the ruins of what had been Chicago. The girl was awake now, truly awake, though her eyes still carried echoes of the frequency she had channeled. The assimilated were slowly recovering, their minds returning to them, though none would ever quite be the same. The resonance was requesting an alliance, a partnership between their technological mastery and humanity's unique gift. A chance to finally stop running and start fighting back. But Sophie was frowning, her young face troubled in a way that made Alina's heart clench. "What is it?" Alina asked. Sophie looked at her, and in that moment she seemed far older than her 12 years. "The silence isn't gone," she said quietly. "It's just thinking, learning. It's never encountered anything like us before. It doesn't know what to do." She paused, her gaze drifting toward the horizon, toward the ships now resting on the scarred earth. "But it will figure it out eventually. It always does." Alina took the girl's hand, feeling the residual hum of the frequency that had saved their species. "At least for now, then we'll be ready." Sophie didn't respond, but in the reflection of her eyes, Alina thought she saw something, a flicker of darkness, a brief moment of absence, as if something was looking back at her from inside the child. Something patient, something hungry, something that was already inside, already waiting, already planning for the next time. The war wasn't over, it had only just begun.